Hello and welcome to Heroic Media. I'm Michelle Bauman.
And I'm Patrick Cordova.
This week on Heroic Media, a white woman in Ohio sues a sperm bank after receiving sperm from a black donor.
An abortion clinic in Michigan is relocated thanks in part to a local Catholic church.
And U.S. pediatricians endorse IUDs for teens.
Stay tuned for all these stories and more here on Heroic Media. So here at Heroic Media, we explore news headlines that deal with a lot of foundational moral issues, issues that are very important to society today. A lot of times we'll talk about family, marriage, life, and those types of topics.
Exactly, and the specific issues we tend to cover often involve abortion, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, human cloning, and homosexual marriage.
Exactly.
So Patrick, what's our first story of the day?
All right, for our first story, an Ohio woman is suing a sperm bank after she received sperm from a black donor instead of from a white donor. So this is kind of a super crazy story with all the people involved and all the craziness that there is. When I first read this, I was like, oh my gosh. And I think that's a lot of people's responses, like just like from reading comments on this story, because it was posted on several sites. But what were your initial reaction?
My initial thought was, what a messy situation.
Yeah.
And sort of like when we deviate from God's plan so drastically, things do get messy.
Yep.
And just giving our viewers a little bit of background, we have a same-sex couple, two women, both of them are white, and they decided to use artificial insemination to become pregnant, but they found out after the fact, after the one woman was already pregnant, that they had mixed up the sperm donors and they had received sperm from a black man instead of a white man.
Yes. And all I could think about when I heard that, they don't give the details, but it sounds like they found out after the baby was born, like they realized this was the wrong sperm. And I could only think like, oh my gosh, what if they found out before the baby was born? I wonder if they would have tried to have an abortion or something like that. And it's just like you said, it seems like one moral issue leads to another moral issue, leads to another moral issue, right? And there's a lot of moral issues with this story, starting with the same-sex union or same-sex marriage that they have between this lesbian couple, and then going down through artificial insemination. And it's just one of these messy situations where there's so much involved. And then I feel so bad for the daughter as well, because this couple, some of the things that they said were pretty harsh. It was, and I can only feel for this girl that when she's getting older, that you Google your name and you're like, oh, I wonder what's on the internet about me. I wonder if Sheila's going to Google her name and see this story, and she's going to be like, oh, my parent, obviously she'll know that she's got two moms or whatever growing up, but she might go, oh, I didn't realize, how things went down, and that, oh, my parents didn't really get exactly the child that they were anticipating.
I wasn't what they wanted,
And I think in a heterosexual marriage where you have a child naturally, it's like there aren't as many of those. There's not going to be surprises like that, right? With two faithful people.
And you're open to, you don't get to pick things.
Yeah.
You are open to what comes with the, the genes involved.
Exactly.
So I thought this was interesting. The comment that one of the women made, that the mom said, she said, how could this happen?
Yeah.
And I thought the answer to that, quite honestly, is because the father in this situation was reduced to a number.
Yeah.
And they accidentally mixed up number 330 and 380.
Literally
the 3
a number.
and the 8 looked the same. So how could this happen? Well, it happens when people are dehumanized, and when we take the beautiful act of reproduction and the beauty of sexuality that God gave to us, and we reduce it to something like a number in a jar. And
well, that's why, when she said, well, she said, how could they make a mistake that was so personal? I thought exactly what you're thinking. I'm like, this doesn't seem like very personal.
It's
like
not personal.
Sperm in a tube in a lab doesn't sound super personal to me.
Exactly. It's ironic. Because, the context in which children are intended to be created is loving, it is personal. This isn't loving, it's not personal, it's very mechanical, very cold. So that's how it happens. And the child is 2 years old now. The woman is just now suing. But they're concerned because they live in a predominantly white neighborhood, an all-white school, and their family can be insensitive. So it sounds like this little girl is going to have a difficult life, and that's sad.
Yeah.
But you just see the messiness when we mess with God's plan for how our life and sexuality is supposed to work.
Yeah, I agree. And it seemed like their comments were very superficial as well, you know, because they were just like, oh, I just hearing their quotes, you know, I don't know if I took them out of context, but it almost seemed like they were kind of like, oh, you know, we live in this white neighborhood and we, you know, we're not sure what's going to happen. And I also thought it was kind of like a double standard, because they were like, you know, they're a lesbian couple, and obviously they've had to deal with diversity and, you know, people, I'm sure, treating them badly.
Right.
And then they're like turning it around and treating their daughter badly because of that she's black, you know. That's what it felt like to me with their comments.
Yeah,
and I was like, what a double standard. It seems like if you really truly love this person, this human being that's part of your genetics, that you would embrace them and try to help them through and overcome adversity when and if it appears, right? And so yeah, I thought there was just so many things. And then I love the therapist's recommendation was for them to move to a more diverse community with good schools. And I'm like, sure, that's exactly what they need. You know, it's like really what they need is the whole situation should have never have come about, right? And the real problem now is that those two women raising that child need to kind of change their mind on how they're viewing their daughter. That was what I thought.
It's an unfortunate situation, and there's not, at this point, I don't know that there is a clear solution, because there's so many complicated factors. But you know, this is the kind of thing that happens, unfortunately, and we just pray for those people and hope that people realize the wisdom in God's plan for
Absolutely.
things.
Couldn't have said it better.
In our next story, an abortion clinic in Lansing, Michigan is closing in a unique way. A Catholic church took over the lease of the building that had been housing the last freestanding abortion clinic in the area.
Interesting. That's an interesting way, right? Kind of a, you know, two sides of a coin there for that you know, little office or whatever. But yeah, so their lease expired, and then a Catholic church bought the space, right, or leased the space in place of them. Apparently their lease expired, and so the Catholic Church had every right to come in there and take over the lease. So that was really interesting. Obviously it was a kind of a tactical move. I wonder how they found out, like, oh, these guys are on a month-to-month lease now because they haven't re-signed, and they came in and got it before they did. It was interesting.
It is interesting, and sort of, you know, it reminds me of the scriptures say, "Behold, I am sending you like sheep in the midst of wolves, so be shrewd as serpents and simple as doves." That's from the Gospel of Matthew. And so things like this, obviously, you know, illegal things can be problematic, and violence is not okay.
Right.
But when you can find sort of shrewd or clever ways to sort of fight abortion, this is, you know, that's a really good thing. And so in this case, they're not doing anything illegal. It was simply a matter of the lease ending, and they're coming in.
Right.
And you just see what a contrast between an abortion clinic where there are lives being taken every single day, and then a church. So there's going to be offices for the church and pro-life offices in this building now.
Exactly.
So you just see such a sharp contrast.
Yeah.
So this is the Church of the Resurrection in Lansing, Michigan, and the building had previously been holding Woman Care Abortion Clinic. So this is the last freestanding abortion clinic in the area. There had been a lot of pro-lifers who had gone there to pray and to demonstrate, and so we see just sort of combined efforts to try to get that place to move. And I don't know how prominent this particular area is, but you know, if it's something that a lot of women are going to see when they drive by or not. But I know other cases where pro-life pregnancy centers have set up right across from an abortion clinic
next to it,
and had a good sign and stuff. And so, you know, I've heard of cases where women were looking for the abortion clinic and found the pro-life pregnancy center, and they were given the resources and the respect and the information that they needed to choose life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, given the full array of their options. So yeah, I agree. And I think initially you might be like, oh, you know, some people might have the reaction when they hear this story about this church coming in and taking over this lease, and then effectively it seems like they're kind of kicking out the abortion clinic. But like you said, it was done legally, and I think we just have to remember that the people were killing babies in there before. So I mean, even if they did come in somehow legally and like truly kick them out, I think it's a situation that warrants that type of action, right? And that was one of the main things I took away. And then also the owner of that abortion clinic that got kicked out, he has a quite a bad past apparently. There's another abortion clinic that was operating under the same name, and apparently they forced, in 1989, I believe it was, they forced a woman to have an abortion there. And yeah, I mean, and they were because of that, they were forced to close down that abortion facility too.
Right.
So hopefully they don't find another place to set up shop.
Right.
You know?
And it's also unclear why exactly their lease, was it just expiring and
Right.
they weren't renewing the lease, or had the landlord had problems? Had there been
Who knows?
more reports of forced abortions? We don't know.
Yep.
But the bottom line is this is sort of a unique, interesting solution. This is, the Catholic Church is going to be moving in there, and so,
Yep.
We'll see if similar things happen in the future.
Yep, absolutely. All right, coming up after the break, we have a special guest, so stay tuned.
Welcome back to Heroic Media. In case you're just joining us, I'm Michelle Bauman.
And I'm Patrick Cordova.
We have a special guest with us for this segment, Dr. Catherine Benish, licensed psychologist and director of the Regina Chaley Clinical Services for Catholic Charities of Denver. Dr. Benish, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and we're going to discuss the following story. The American Academy of Pediatrics recently recommended IUDs and implants as the best form of birth control for teenage girls. So this was quite shocking. I think there's a lot of different things we can discuss, but the first thing that jumped out to me was, when I think of pediatrics, especially because I have two small kids, I think of young children, right? And pediatrics is geared towards adolescents, right, and children and infants, so anybody
Exactly.
underneath the age of 18. So it was quite shocking that an organization that is supposed to be, talking about that age group was making a recommendation regarding these IUDs and everything. What was your initial reaction along those lines?
Well, overall, I was very disappointed.
Yeah.
It just seems like the Academy is capable of so much better than that. And, in the past, they have had a great reputation of providing information to pediatricians that helped in the health care of children and adolescents.
Right.
And this article seemed like it didn't measure up to the high standards that they usually adhere to, primarily because regardless of what your perspective is on contraception,
Right.
from a scientific perspective,
Right.
we simply don't have the data to make definitive statements such as they made in the article.
What type of data do you think that we would be good to have for them to make that statement?
More long-term data. We don't know what IUDs are going to do to 12-year-olds.
Right.
We don't know the long-term effects. We don't even know the long-term effects for 15-year-olds,
Yeah.
or in some cases even a little bit older than
Yeah.
that. Is this going to cause permanent sterilization? With perforated uteruses, with a developing child.
Yeah, exactly.
We have no idea. And they don't have the data because there's never been such a broad-based recommendation.
Yeah.
So they simply don't have the data to be saying what they're saying in a definitive way.
I agree.
As a psychologist, do you think that promoting IUDs and hormonal implants to young teens, do you think that that's going to encourage earlier sexual activity? And if so, what are some of the consequences of that psychologically and emotionally?
Sure, it will. And probably it will be the more impoverished kids. Because now with the Affordable Health Care Act, it's paid for. And as I understand, IUDs are $800 to $1,000. Now the government will pick that up, and the child does not have to inform the parent.
Right. I think that's a big problem too, right? Is this parental consent type thing, right? Because they're still adolescents, they're still children, especially in their parents' eyes, but also legally under the law, right? In states, it's the age is 18. So, there's a reason that there's certain laws and consent laws and different things like that, right, that are put in place And that's to protect children and allow parents to actually do what their job is, and that's parent, right?
They've lowered the age
Yeah.
in many states now, so children much younger than 18
Exactly.
can receive those services without parental permission.
Yep, exactly. And I think that's a dangerous trend because that, I mean, like Michelle was saying, do you think this will lead to more sexual activity and things like that? And of course, it's got to, right? It must. And having the conversation about sex with your parents is, of course, one of those really uncomfortable conversations. And of course, yeah, so it's only making it easier, I think, for basically children to go to somebody else other than their parents as well. I think one thing too that came to mind, you mentioned scientific, and so I couldn't help but think of hormonal contraceptives, and I know there's been a recent study that came out too that shows that those can increase cancer risk and things like that. So that's another thing that they haven't taken into consideration, because those IUDs can be hormonally can deliver hormones.
Exactly, exactly. And again, with the developing child, we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
We know some bad effects for adults,
Right.
but I would think that we're going to see very deleterious effects on these kids. And what's going to happen when that happens?
Right.
Even things like perforated uterus is, not common, but certainly one of the side effects of IUDs.
Right.
So you have a 12-year-old that comes in,
Yeah.
or 14 or 15 or 17,
Right.
and without parental permission, the doctor inserts an IUD,
Right.
and it perforates the uterus. The child starts bleeding out, and most of the 15-year-olds I know are not going to go to their parents and say, oh, you know what, I had this done, and,
Right.
and there's probably a side effect. So the parents are not going to know why this child is bleeding.
Right.
If the child dies, there's probably going to be litigation.
Oh yeah, that's true. That is a
Yeah.
worst case scenario too. I
That's
didn't
a
think
worst
about
case
that, because the
scenario.
daughter is probably going to be not wanting to tell her parents what she did.
Sure.
So yeah, so there is definitely a risk that something horrible is going to happen.
Yeah.
So this story also came with this kind of notion that pregnancy is unsafe, and using these
Right.
contraceptives is so much so much safer. What are your thoughts on that? Just like society's view on that, and just how does that affect the psychology?
Let's look at this actual quote for a minute. This is a quote from the policy statement that the AAP put out. Regardless of which method of contraception is chosen, pediatricians should stress that all methods of hormonal birth control are safer than pregnancy.
Right.
What's your response to that?
Yeah.
Again, we come back to the scientific research.
Yeah.
So where's the data? That's what I want to know. Where's the data? How can you make a definitive statement like this? Again, regardless of your view on contraception, how can you make a definitive statement like that?
Right.
When we simply don't have the data to show that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think people kind of try to make things seem scarier than they are too. I've seen comments, when articles like this come out, and people are like, well, for people that are having babies at a younger age, like teenager, it's so much more deadly for them, or dangerous. They have like this, and I'm like, like you said, where are the statistics? Where are the facts that show these sorts of things too?
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Benish, thank you so much for being here, for offering some of your insight, and just for joining us on the show.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
All right. Coming up after the break, we have one more story, so stay tuned.
Hello and welcome back to Heroic Media. In our final story for the day, a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome can often lead to shock and even grief for the expectant parents. But now a new study finds that over time, those reactions often turn to joy and love.
It's a nice ending. There's just so much, seems like, negativity towards children with Down syndrome.
Absolutely.
And I think it's something like 98% of children that are, diagnosed with Down syndrome before they're born are aborted. And it's just a horrible statistic to have, right? There's so many things we could talk about, but why don't we start with the study? And the study I thought was really interesting, because just seeing how people reacted to their children with Down syndrome when they were born, and I couldn't help but think, because they talked about she talked about this dream is born when a child is conceived. And I couldn't help but to relate to that, because that's how I totally was with my first child. And you know, you get a picture in your mind of like, okay, my kid's gonna look like this, and, you know, my kid's gonna have blonde hair and gonna have blue eyes, you know, like look like me or whatever, right? And then the first thing I thought, like when my son came out, I was like, he's got red hair. I was like it was like the last thing on my mind, and I was like, I just had not even crossed my mind that red hair is in like runs in my family, but I just hadn't thought about it, you know. So I could totally relate to that like initial shock. You know, you paint this dream, this picture in your mind, and you try to imagine what your kid's going to look like, and so that's what a lot of these peoples that were in the study said. You know, they just had this idea of and this dream is what they specifically called it, of what their child was going to be like. And then once they found out that their child, you know, they saw their child was born with Down and had Down syndrome, it was kind of like that dream was just destroyed. And so, you know, I think going forward for me, I always, at that initial shock, you know, and obviously every parent loves their child, you know, but that initial shock of like having something different than you imagined in your mind, I could totally relate to that.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
And I think it really brings up a serious point, the idea that this conception, this idea, the dream that you have of your child doesn't necessarily match reality. And so once that baby is born, it's like, okay, whether I wanted a boy or a girl or a redhead or a blonde, okay, here's this concrete human being in front of me to love and to take care of. And I thought this study was very interesting. I am not aware of any studies that had been done before that were specifically tracking the attitudes of parents over time. And so initially what they found was that there was really this shock and this grief, and it was as if the child of our dreams had died. That was one of the quotes.
Right.
And you just see how it transitions from the initial diagnosis to later. And this article was actually called "The Upside of Down Syndrome." Kind of clever. But the researcher here, her name is Dr. Marcia Van Riper. She's the chair of the Family Health Division at the University of North Carolina School of Nursing. And so she conducted this significant study. And what she said was, the families I interviewed consistently reported that the positive consequences associated with raising a child with Down syndrome far outweighed the negative consequences. My first reaction to that quote, I never hear anyone talk about the positive consequences of raising a child with Down syndrome. It's pointed out as this huge suffering, this huge burden. Exactly.
Yeah, I thought the same exact thing, because nobody ever really talks about that. And I think that I like that they did the study, because light needs to be shed on what it's like to have a child with Down syndrome, right? And I just love that. It's nice to see how they transition, because society and mainstream media and everything has kind of an idea of what it is going to be like for you to have a child with Down syndrome. And the vast majority of these people who responded all had a positive experience after, you know, having their child and growing up, you know, growing with their child. And they themselves grew in ways that they didn't really think that they would, right?
Absolutely.
They grew in love and joy. Instead of using words like tragedy and suffering and burden, they used words like joy and challenge or thriving, right? And so I think that it's really interesting. Obviously, it's not all rose petals and everything when you have a child with a disability, but God puts those children in your life for a reason, right? And I think that it's nice, because, you know, initially you might have almost a sense of disappointment because your dream is not what you thought it would be, but it's really God knows best. And I think that that's, even though they don't explicitly say, I think that's what these families experience, right? And they learn and grow and love, you know, bigger and better than they could before without having that child in their life.
Absolutely. And, you know, it made me wonder, I think on one hand, we absolutely have to respect the fear, the grief, and the shock that people go through when they get this initial diagnosis. But at the same time, it makes me wonder how much of that is caused by this social stigma and this negative social perception of people with Down syndrome. Because they went through and asked them, what words would you associate with what you're going through? And initially with the diagnosis, they were saying it's a tragedy, it's a burden, this is all about suffering. But that's before they've actually experienced it. And then once they're raising this child, living with this child, that's when you get the words like joy and love. And so I just wonder, the sharp contrast, how much of that has to go along with the idea there's so much pressure. Women go in, they get this diagnosis with Down syndrome. Oftentimes there's pressure from the doctor. I've heard of people who the doctor says, oh, okay, you know, your baby has Down syndrome. Let me set up your abortion. Doesn't even ask them, just tells them. So how much of this can be changed if we just have adequate information and education and resources and respect?
Right, and it kind of goes along with that whole kind of children are a product mentality, kind of like the stories we talked about earlier with the artificial insemination and everything, because parents will get that, I think it's called an amniocentesis, and we always pass it up because we're like, if our child has a disability, then our child has a disability. We don't really care, and we don't want to put our child at any extra risk. And so, you know, when so many doctors just assume, like you were saying, you know, they get that test result back and they find out there's something wrong or that society perceives as wrong, right, in the case of Down syndrome, and then they're like automatically assume that you're going to have an abortion. You know, doctors assume things all the time. Like after our last child, you know, the doctor was like, oh, well, you know, while we're in there, why don't we just, you know, do you want us to, you know, tie your tubes and, you know, and it's like, gosh, really? Like, so they make a lot of assumptions, and so yeah, you're right. You know, having that broad array of information available and everything, I think is really helpful. Not to mention like the studies that are done on how do these Down syndrome children feel about life and about each other and their family, and they experience so much joy. Like they're just full of joy. You know, it's like they're little bundles of joy. Like they all just love life, and you know, or the vast majority of them at least.
Yeah.
So
they did a study and found that individuals with Down syndrome report being happy with their lives more than those who do not have Down syndrome. And just a couple of other quick statistics to finish us off. 79% of parents and guardians said that their outlook on life was more positive because of their child with Down syndrome. 79%, and 88% of siblings ages 12 and up said that having a sibling with Down syndrome made them a better person.
That's great.
So we see the joy that these people bring to their lives once we get past that sort of negative social impression.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's wonderful. It's nice to have solid numbers behind it too.
Absolutely.
All right, that's it for this week on Heroic Media. Please join us next week for all the up-to-date news on the pro-life issues that matter to you.
Please feel free to write to us with any comments, questions, or news tips at news@heroicmedia.org.
And please visit our website at heroicmedianews.org, where you can check out more stories like the ones we discussed on this episode.
That's it for this week. Until next time, please keep us in your prayers.
God bless.